This is the Press Play podcast, brought to you by Real Resilience.
This is the train to Watford Junction. Next station, Harleston.
So, now we're away from the traffic, I best tell you where I'm off to. I'm in North London on a lovely, bright, sunny, late November morning. And I'm off to see Sound Mastering. They're an archive transferring company who specialise in transferring material from a variety of formats, be it vinyl, DAT, and, of course, tape.
Hiya.
Hello, it's Ian Batson.
Stay there, Ian. I'll come and get you.
Hello,
Ian, I am indeed.
I'm
Come
Ian
on
Batson.
in. I am Nick Robbins, and I am a senior mastering engineer at Sound Mastering. We specialise in reissue, and that can be anything from 1930s recordings on grubby old 78s, right the way through to the reissues that we're doing now of digital material from the 90s and the early 2000s.
Press Play, the Real Resilience podcast, dedicated to all things reel to reel.
What always intrigues me is it's nearly knocking 2020. How much more of this stuff is still out there that needs transferring? I mean,
That's an incredibly good question. Yes, it really is, actually, because as someone who's seen a lot of very obscure recordings come through his hands one way or another, it continues to astonish me when they find things that have not been played, for 40 years, 50
I mean,
years.
you get these headline stories, they find some old Beatles demos in some attic, or there's some David Bowie master tapes have been re-released. I mean, so we hear these headline things, but how much more of the, let's call it run-of-the-mill or even specialist material is out there that hasn't been transferred over to, let's call it a current playable format?
The obvious answer to that is less than there was. But the answer is I don't know. We still spend some of our time, one of my colleagues that's what he does. He spends all his time copying from disc and from old analog tape. So things keep still being found, particularly in America, actually, where the industry was much more disparate than here. And what I mean by that is localized, because you would have record companies all over the country in America, small ones.
Well, Sun Records obviously is an obvious one that signed Elvis. It's small town. Yeah.
When it was originally.
When it started, yes.
Not now.
Not now. But it was a small,
Yeah.
walk in, record, cut your own recording, which
Absolutely.
is something in the UK we never really had, did we? It was the
Yeah, and
majors.
but they also had very localized. Many records in America never got outside of their state or their local radio broadcast station, if you like. There's still stuff to be found there, I suspect. How much of it's of any real importance? Well, importance is a bad word to use here, because all music's important to somebody. But how much of it would be of any interest to the general public, I'm not so sure. It's all very specialist now. Everything that's unearthed that was not known about will likely be mostly of interest to people who follow a particular genre or are fascinated by a particular city in America or wherever it might be.
One of my favourite artists who did nothing for years after his death, of course, is Nick Drake.
Oh, yes.
And he kind of just faded away, and then for whatever reason he encountered a resurgence. So consequently the record company is now scratching around trying to find anything that might be Nick Drake related. I know there were some family recordings that were unearthed a good few years ago and they remastered those. So you get to get that sometimes where maybe a film picks up on an obscure artist and everybody goes, I've got to discover this artist, and therefore the record companies is starting to scrabble around looking for anything they recorded to get it out, and therefore you need to remaster it.
Yes, of course. Yes, that does happen. Of course it does. And also, of course, we're now in the world where many artists are now having box sets put out of everything they do. And of course the record company is going to want to have unissued material on there if it possibly can. There are a number of occasions when I've let's say, for example, you've got an act who were reasonably successful but not world famous in any way, and they may have done 3 albums or 4 albums. You will then see the record company wanting to reissue that, but have something extra to give to the fans. Very often, of course, if the band is still alive, then that's not too difficult to find, because you can find live recordings, sometimes on cassette or even on DAT or something like that, and they can be brought up to scratch as best as possible. That's the sort of thing they're looking for. Sometimes you will even get, I've had examples where I've had the band bringing in cassettes of them larking about on tour, just recording in the hotel rooms or whatever else it is, and there are snippets that we can take from that give you a sort of insight into what life was like for them on the road at the time, and that can be interesting too, but you would keep that to a minimum, simply because out of context it can often be a bit meaningless, if you see what I mean, and so you wouldn't necessarily use a lot of that, but it does help. Anything unreleased is always what the record company is looking for. Or for that matter, it's not just the record company. Very often, obviously, the record companies employ specialists and compilers when they're putting projects together, and mainly because they're experts in whoever it is the artist is. And as a consequence, they will have a better idea of what might be available out there. Even on the internet, for example, there are things on the internet that are only available there because somebody's decided to put up an old cassette or an old recording that they've made.
What's your take personally? That I think probably the Beatles started it with their anthology releases. That kind of it's off the cutting room floor. It was never good enough to be released the first time, and now the record companies are scrabbling around doing all these outtakes, second versions. What is your take? Do you ever get that point and think, why the heck am I transferring this?
Well, I mean, it's easy to understand why people might be interested in the Beatles.
Yeah.
Or
I'm using them as a headline.
I know you are, but
yeah.
the context of it is this.
Yeah.
Is that we know so much about them. It's almost as though they're part of our family, if you like. I know more about the individual members of the Beatles probably than I do about some members of my own family. Mm. So I think there's always an interest in anything that they did. And of course, they did, relatively speaking, they had quite a long career, actually. It feels short, but it wasn't at the time. And so they were busy all the time, and they were being filmed and recorded and interviewed all the time. So there's masses of material available. When you start to talk about, however, about a band that much further down, in terms of the public's interest or indeed knowledge, then I think you have to be very careful, because I've done a number of things over the years where I've thought exactly that. Why does the public need this? It doesn't. And I've also had discussions with members of bands, and bands themselves can argue about this. I've had that here where you're assembling a box set of outtakes or something, and whilst they're of interest to the real collectors, they're of no interest to the ordinary fans, if you like, because what they like is the records. They don't really want to hear the demo version. They don't really want to hear the version that's not got the right vocal on it. They don't. It's a real problem when the record company's desperate for additional material, but the band are of the view that everything that was on the cutting room floor was there for a reason. So I'm actually I'm in the camp that says, unless there's a very good reason. For example, you might look at an artist like B.B. King. B.B. King was quite interesting in the studio because he would often record several versions of a song in different keys, in different tempos, with different arrangements, until he settled on one that he liked. That is interesting. And when you have that sort of thing, then I think it can be interesting. But even that, you don't want too much of it, Because at the end of the day, the reason why they settled on the final performance they settled on is because it's the one that carries the emotion and the connection that they wanted to achieve. The others are really just an example of how they got there. Interesting to some people, perhaps, but of limited interest to the wider world, I think.
Going back to Nick Drake, they released I've forgotten the name of it now, the exact name of the album, but it was a family collection of his mother performing and him performing as probably as a teenager. Brings me on to my next question. Clearly it was recorded probably on a 5-inch reel on a domestic tape machine of indifferent quality, in spite of the fact the Drake family were probably rich enough to afford a nice machine, but it was still a domestic machine. When I listened to it, I thought, this is a fantastic transfer. Obviously, I don't know what remedial work, nip and tucking and a bit of painting and what have you has gone in to get it to the state where I was listening to it. But when you do a transfer, what kind of formats are you getting? You're getting these 5-inch reels of tape. You're getting scratched old vinyl.
Absolutely. If you look at that pile over there, which
down there we've got this?
These are
Zona tape. Yeah.
And many of these tapes here are domestic format.
We've got some 15-inch reels here and 7-inch.
Yeah, they're from professional studio.
Yes.
But there are some here that are just demos. That's probably, I haven't looked at this yet. It says on it that it's 15 IPS stereo CCIR, which suggests to me that that's actually done on a professional machine.
We're looking at a 7-inch reel here, and there's various others. Colin Blunstone there.
Yeah, this is Colin Blunstone, yes. And there are others here. This one, for example, I know because I've transferred this, is just him on a domestic machine running through some ideas with a guitar. It's as simple as that. But it's interesting because, of course, Colin is one of those people who, even when he's not trying, sounds fantastic. And so there's interest in there's some interest in this. I mean, actually, the general public will probably never hear most of this. We might pick. Well, not me personally, but the people running the project will maybe pick one of the best of these.
I suppose this is a commercial project that they're looking to realise some value out of it. But at the same time, you're also saving it for posterity.
Absolutely,
because we know these tapes are not. They are, as you hold them there, they are degrading. You know,
yes.
you obviously bake these tapes before.
Well, it depends. I wouldn't bake this, for example, which is an Emmy tape. It doesn't have the sticky tape syndrome problem. If I don't know what it is, I will probably bake it.
I'm looking at a 5-inch reel of Zona tape. I've never heard of that tape. I don't know what format it was. It looks 1960s style.
That it isn't necessarily true that the tape inside the box is
very
what the box
true.
says.
Very true. But it's a good start that the reel looks in good condition, and the box does. There's no moisture on the box.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely.
It's not being installed in some wet old basement.
No, but we do get those, of course.
Of course.
But in this instance,
and the pancake looks very nice as well on it.
Well, that's because I've transferred it and rebound it. But in fact, it was actually very good. I suspect this hasn't seen the light of day since it was done. They're backing track mixes. Actually,
this is more Colin Blunstone.
It isn't in this case. It's actually Argent. And I suspect that these were backing track mixes that were taken from when the studio sessions were being done. Probably practice vocals, possibly. Mm-hmm. This will have been one of the members of the band was given this to take home, I expect.
I've never heard of Zona tape. It's clearly one of these tapes that was maybe even as a company just bought its stock in from one of the major manufacturers in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Would you bake that tape because you don't know its provenance?
Yes.
You would?
Yes, I would.
Just to be on the safe side?
Yes, I would. Because it's generally true that if the tape doesn't have sticky tape, baking it doesn't cause it a problem at all. I mean, we're not baking these things at high temperatures. We're baking them at low temperatures for a long time.
Well, baking could be the whole subject of a separate podcast, but I think there is this idea that, and I read on the internet forums, baking as though you're sticking it in a gas mark 3 for 3 hours, making a casserole. Oh no.
No.
But we're depart from that. So you don't just bake everything that comes through the door.
Not necessarily, no. As I say, if I have no idea of what the stock is, the tape stock, then I generally will do. But if I know that it's from tape stock that's too early to have the problem, so anything, I mean, you can absolutely be sure of anything prior to 1970, and probably actually anything prior to about 1974, to be honest, doesn't have the problem. And in theory, everything after mid-90s probably doesn't have the problem, although that's not entirely true.
True.
Because, of course, there was still a lot of stock around, even when they discovered the sticky tape problem. So some were still being used and then had problems after the event. But it's a specific time period, and you know that the problem areas are Ampex, Agfa, to a lesser extent Scotch and Basf. Interestingly enough, I've never in my life had to bake a cassette.
Really?
However, it's now standard practice to bake the early digital formats, i.e. U-matic and Betamax. There's evidence, well, a lot of evidence that they are beginning to suffer the same problem. And even some DATs can benefit from it too. So it's not something confined entirely to the analogue domain.
It's rust stuck on a backing with some glue.
Yes.
And depending on what the type of backing, depending on the rust, and most importantly, the binder, the glue, it's going to suffer.
Yes.
It depends. And of course, chemistry moves along through the years. Interesting you say Agfa had an issue, but Basf didn't.
Well,
I mean, I thought the two were kind of related with these sort of German chemical industries. I mean, the tape I know best is what is Zonal, Regal Zonal 675, which is Agfa 468 formulation, but I don't know what Zonal did with what binder they used.
Yeah.
But I've never known that shed.
No, I've never known that shed, but we don't see much of that, to be honest. We really don't. I mean, the vast majority of tape that we see is going to be either Ampex, Agfa, or Basf. Slightly earlier, a lot of Scotch. But the truth is that you just don't know. So generally, when you're faced with the major manufacturers like that, you would generally bake them, because you're not going. We do have situations where baking will harm the tape, but the truth is that you've got no choice. You either have to bake it and it still falls to pieces, or because you can't put it on a machine if it's got sticky tape syndrome, because it will just shed. So you've only got one chance, which is, well, you can rebake. I mean, the tapes can be baked again if they start to suffer the same problem again 10 years later or whatever. But we have had situations where we've baked a tape and it's collapsed completely. I mean, it's hilarious when you see it do it, because it's worse than putting it on the machine with sticky tape. It throws it everywhere.
Yeah,
it fills the room with chaos.
The tape guides, you can see it's just building up like mud on a wheel arch.
When it really gives way,
yes.
It's way worse than that.
Yeah.
It just starts throwing this stuff all over the room. It's incredible.
This is the Press Play Podcast, brought to you by Real Resilience.
We'll leave my interview with Nick Robbins there for now. More from our conversation a little later. At Real Resilience, we can announce that we now have stock of a large selection of NOS and refurbished parts for the Ewer 4000 series machines, from flywheel capstans to motors and even a complete headblock. Please visit the store on the Real Resilience website. You can find it at www.realresilience.co.uk. In the interview with Nick, we talked a lot about baking tapes, and I think this can be the subject of a future cast in itself, as there seems to be a fair bit of confusion as to what the term actually means, what the process is, what it does, and indeed why do it in the first place. Taking this last point of what it actually is, sticky shed syndrome is the name given to the deterioration of magnetic tape, any tape for that matter, not just that used to record analogue audio. And it's where the binder used to hold the oxide to the backing tape contains polyurethane. This chemical absorbs water and causes it to rise up through the oxide to the surface. Now, although you won't feel the tape is sticky to the touch, it does make the tape stick to the next layer of tape on the spool and to the transport of a machine, and as you run the tape through the machine, it literally scrapes the oxide off in the process. The action of baking the tape, and truth be told, it's not putting the tape in the oven, don't do that, if you do you'll have more than sticky tape to contend with, is to drive the moisture out of the binder, removing the stickiness. It does not, as I've read in some posts, make the binder softer like a glue and stick the oxide back onto the backing. There are various ways of removing the moisture, but all are fundamentally the same. Warming the tape up slowly over a number of hours to a temperature that will not affect the backing, and then removing the heat and letting the tape cool down, again over a number of hours. I use a food dehydrator to bake my tapes, and amazingly the one I bought off Amazon for about £40, $50, perfectly fits 10.5-inch reels. It could have been made for it. But I've also seen people make wooden boxes with a 60-watt light bulb as a heat source. Using the dehydrator method takes about 8 hours, 4 hours to warm the tape up, switch the machine off and allow the same length of time for it to cool down. Now we'll go back to the second part of my chat with Nick Robbins, Senior Mastering Engineer at Sound Mastering, and talk about the next stage of rescuing old recordings, the clean-up process. So you've baked your tape, or maybe you haven't, you think it doesn't need doing, you've got this archive
No, I have to
material.
be sure. If I, in order not to bake it, I have to know the stock and I have to know the date.
Okay.
And in those instances, then I will put it on the tape recorder without baking, but I'm looking at it really hard.
So you've got this tape ready to be transferred, and as you said, you're looking at it really hard. There must be a combination of trepidation, but also excitement as to what you're going to find on this thing. We've seen that this thing says some of these tapes say Colin Blunstone. You think, oh, great, I'm a great Colin Blunstone fan. I know his material, but you wonder actually what is it? What's actually on it? Do you ever get that
The
excitement?
fact of the matter is that I've never come across an artist yet who, when you play it to them, doesn't go, "Oh, I remember that." Because it's an interesting thing about music. I mean, music does take you straight back to where you were when you made it. It happens for me as an engineer. If I listen to a recording that I made in the 1980s, I'm immediately in the room. I remember it. I don't remember it in total detail, but I remember the feeling of the session. I remember the people. I remember, I remember the smell of the studio, if you like, which is largely the smell of old tape. Yes.
So after the trepidations, whether it's going to strip the tape, it's then the memories come floating back.
Yeah, well, only if you're part of it. If you're
Yeah.
playing something that you didn't have any part of, then it is interesting if it's an artist you like.
I
Certainly.
suppose it's an interest, like the Beatles anthology is a good example. You think, hey, that's what they were doing. I'm in the studio with them, albeit,
Well,
it's
in
not
the case
yeah.
of the particular tape we were talking about earlier on, I think that's Colin working through ideas as to what he might record. So he's
Sketches.
He's sketching, yeah. It's a writing aid to some degree, but he's going through a batch of songs that he's then going to think about which ones he's going to use when he records his album. And also, I think it's probably he made the recording to give to the producers to say, this is how it might sound if I do it, and what do you think I should be recording? So there's lots of things they may have been made for. I mean, it's great for me because I know Colin, of course, and it's lovely listening to him as a relatively young man, because these date back to the 1970s, and noticing that actually his voice is still as good now as it was then. It really is, and he's excellent. But it's sometimes you put the tape on and you listen to it and you think to yourself, who on earth would ever want to hear this? And that can be for many reasons. It could be just because as a professional I'm listening to it and thinking it sounds terrible. But you never know. You just don't, because you don't know how it fits into the bigger context of whoever the artist is. And you don't know how the expert, if you like, or the compiler is going to use it in the context of a release. So sometimes you just have to say to yourself, it's not my cup of tea, but actually this
business.
is my job.
Yes, it's business.
Yeah, and my job is to transfer the best possible copy I can, for, as we talked about earlier, for two reasons. One, to archive it, and two, for possible use. I have no idea how it might be used in the future. All I can do is make sure that I can get the best possible transfer I can so that it can be used in the future.
What other formats are you transferring?
Everything.
Because
Well, no, not quite everything. We don't do wax cylinder.
let's stick to tape. I mean, yeah, we've got your IPS, your 7.5, 15, 3 3/4, wherever it's recorded at, but you've then just got your half-inch or your quarter track. I mean, how do you,
we
you put
have...
this thing on and so, hang on, you're getting stuff coming backwards out of it.
Absolutely. But actually, funnily enough, more often than not, it's quarter track because of the type of stock it is. Yeah. It's a domestic stock. It's not a professional stock. So, but you're absolutely right. If it's quarter track and you put it on a half track machine, you'll get half of it coming backwards at the same time. Yeah,
Yes.
that's right.
Yeah.
But we've got machines here. We've got quarter track. We don't use it that much actually, but it's it's available and we do use it. But most of what we do, I would say, 80% of what we do is either at 7.5 or 15. We will occasionally see a 3 3/4, but that again would be very likely to be a quarter track domestic format, not it's not a professional format in any form. But we've also seen not just 7.5 and 15, but 30 IPS quarter inch, which is unusual. It's a very rare thing to come across a 30 IPS quarter inch, but they do exist. And then, of course, we've got the half inches. And we've also got 1/2 inch machine where we can put a mono block on it, because during a certain period in the 1950s, they were just doing mono straight to 1/2 inch. And that's an amazing format, of course. It really is, because you're looking at a massive head for one track. And then we've got other facilities, not here, but we have another colleague of ours who has all the multi-track machines. And he has 8-track and 24-track, and 24-track has a 16-track head block as well. So he would do all our multi-track transfers. What else have we got? We've got a specially built pink triangle deck for playing big acetates from the 1950s usually, but sometimes can be the 40s. And they would have been the equivalent of the master tape. And quite frequently those acetates will have more than one version of a song. So you'll see 2 or 3 takes.
Do you ever take them off end user vinyl?
Yes, of course.
Yeah,
all the time, because quite frequently it's the only thing still available. And also we do quite a lot of dubbing of vinyl for reference purposes. So if somebody's going to do a facsimile edition of a vinyl release, they need to know the gaps are the same as on the original. They need to know that it basically sounds similar. And so, or not necessarily. I mean, if we can improve the sound of it, we do. But that's subjective. Not everybody may perhaps think that our improvement is actually an improvement, but we like to think it is generally, or we don't do it.
Do you ever say this is the best you're going to get? A good example, you've got a 1/4 inch tape, and one channel's got a lot of edge damage on it, but one channel is better than others. Do you say, well, we can rescue the right channel, perhaps?
Generally speaking, if the recording is in stereo, we will keep it that way, and we will repair as best we can after the event. It would be unusual for us to decide to mono a stereo. But we do sometimes have situations where there's tape damage on one side, as one edge, as you're talking about, especially if the tape's been badly stored and spooled badly. It can crinkle.
Crushing on it.
Yeah, that's right. In those instances, what we would probably do is put it on, if it's mono, we would put it on a stereo machine, listen to the 2 sides, and inevitably pick the one that had least damage. Sometimes you'll get tapes where, again with monos, where you'll get bits of dropout going on all over the place, and sometimes that can be an advantage to put that on a stereo machine, because then you can cut between left and right if the dropout's particular to one channel. But these are all things that don't go on at the transfer stage. They're all things that go on at the restoration and mastering stage, which is a later process.
But clearly, though, you'd still want to start off with the best source material you can.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, you're using Pro Tools here, are you?
No, this is Sequoia.
Oh, right, I see.
But my colleague uses Sadie.
I don't know Sequoia. I know Sadie.
Well, Pro Tools is a fantastic thing for multi-tracking. I'm mastering, so I'm dealing with stereo usually, not always. Monos and stereo. I could mix multi-track with this, and I do sometimes. But my job is mostly mastering for CD and vinyl. So you're looking here at something that's been set up for doing 2-track.
I see. Well, we're looking at two sort of 22-inch screens, I think they are, side by side, and there's the waveform information for the tracks. There's also other windows for spectral analysis. I can see stereo spread, and what else have we got on here?
Well,
stereo image, stereo boost.
No,
this is a mastering piece of software.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It's actually a radio broadcast piece of software, but it works very well for me too. It has many things, this particular piece of software. You can see all the processes that it will do.
Noise gate, natural dynamics, auto EQ.
All that
AGC? Really?
No, I don't use that. you have to remember this was originally a piece of design for a radio broadcast. So there's many aspects to this that I would not need to go anywhere near. Auto EQ would be very rare for me to use, but it's not impossible, and that I might choose to use it sometimes. But generally speaking, what you're looking at in this particular program is azimuth correction. Now, if you've got your hands on the analog tape, you can do azimuth correction at the transfer process, and so you should. Especially, for example, if you've then got something that's got Dolby on it or anything like that.
So that's actually mechanically adjusting the head.
Oh, of course. Yeah, absolutely. And but often we get things that come in from elsewhere. Perhaps it might be somebody who's got a tape, but they're not happy to let it out of their hands. And so they will do a transfer for us on whatever tape recorder they've got. And they might not necessarily know how to do or want to do azimuth adjustment at that point. So I have a piece of software here that will do that in the digital domain. I actually have another piece of software that will do it on a separate standalone system called Cedar, which is our main restoration equipment, that will also do azimuth adjustment as well.
I know Cedar from declicking.
That's right. That's right.
Yes,
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Well, they have a suite of plugins that you can, well, they do declicking, decrackling, dehissing, all those things, but they also do azimuth correction and vinyl speed correction as well, if you need it. So that's, you're actually looking at a screen here where I'm doing some restoration, or I'm looking at a project to restore it. In this instance, for digital use for streaming platforms, which in this instance we're mostly looking at Spotify or Apple or Amazon. And I'm taking something where we've got a very good sounding version of it, but for those particular platforms, it's probably a little bit loud. So I'm looking at adjusting the levels of that.
What was the source material of this?
The source material of this originally was the analogs, but this is something where the record company want to use an existing set of mastering that was done for CD. Mainly because there was a lot of work done on the original of this, and to recreate that for this processing, in other words, to go back to an earlier source material is not economically viable for them. So that's what I'm doing here, and then there will be a subsequent stage to this afterwards where I will worry about things like EQ and compression and various other things that you might use in the mastering world. In relevance to what we've been talking about most of the time, which is trying to get the best possible source that we can, there are some very obvious problems that we come across when we're not in control of that, and so you do need these restoration tools.
Do you ever get the record company leaning on you, but saying, squash it to death, compress it to death, it's got to be loud,
Of course.
Yes.
Yeah, of course. It's a constant battle for us. Although I have to say that over the course of the last 3 to 4 years, there's less of that. It tends to come from bands very often, as much as the record companies. They want their record to sound as loud as Beyonce's latest, and quite often that's not actually possible. And sometimes it's not pertinent to what they're doing. And also, for a very long time now, mastering engineers have felt that abusing music by making it as loud as you possibly can is probably counterproductive in the end. It turns people off.
Volume is no substitute for talent.
Correct. Yes. And but also it's that thing where the louder I make your CD, the more you have to turn the volume control down.
Exactly.
Which in technical terms is not a good idea anyway, actually, because most amplifiers prefer to be operating somewhere in the middle range of their level control, if you like, not right down at the bottom. Where there's the most distortion.
Yeah, I agree entirely.
Yeah. So but that's a difficult one to explain to people, I'm afraid. But more often than not, we are able to explain that, because one of the things that you can do is you can give people 2 or 3 copies of something, all at the same listening level, but all with the limiting in a different place. And when they hear that, they realise, because you can clearly hear that the louder I make this, the less it's done, the less the dynamics are there, and you squash it all into a big lump rather than allowing it to breathe.
Really, isn't it?
Yes,
a heavy pudding rather than a light souffle.
Indeed, yeah. But on the other hand, there are some contexts where actually being loud is probably more important than being sonically brilliant, because it's a genre, it's a type of music, and so we have to be aware of that. And I've got one at the moment. I'm doing a reissue of a heavy metal album, and I did the first set of remasters and sent them to them, and they said they came back to me immediately and said it's quieter than what we gave you. And so I emailed them back and said, yes, that's because I've rebuilt your dynamic, because it was all a bit squashed. And they came back and said, but it won't be as loud. And I said, well, you're going to cut it to vinyl, so it will be as loud as the cutting engineer can achieve on the vinyl. It won't make any difference what you give him. I can squash it to death at this end. I can assure you he won't like me doing that.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're toing and froing about that at the moment, because what we're probably going to settle on is that for the vinyl version, they will use the levels that I think were appropriate for vinyl cutting, and then perhaps for the CD we'll give it a 2 or 3 dB or something. If I can't convince them that it's a bad idea, and there may be all kinds of reasons I don't know about that would want where they would want it to be louder. But generally speaking, making something loud isn't necessarily the best idea.
Nick and I talked for nearly 2 hours, and we brought his colleague Graham into the conversation too. We went on to talk about the source machines and other aspects of the transfer process. Because there's so much to cover, I'm going to leave that to a future episode, so be sure to catch it when I release it. In the meantime, thanks to all at Sound Mastering for their time, and don't forget you can catch up with Real Resilience on our Facebook page and on our website too. So in the meantime, thanks for listening and keep it real.
Find Real Resilience on the web at realresilience.co.uk and on our Facebook page, Real Resilience.